Tweaking games and adapting the rules to improve everyone's fun is something that I love doing. It's easy to do if you have a bit of know-how, and it has the potential to completely uplift the mood at the game table. It's my willingness to alter the rules that has made one of my campaigns so enjoyable. I'm talking about my Sens, the philosophical role-playing game campaign. I am very excited for this game today. Now, it's okay for me to change the original game's intentions because the original game is kind of terrible and all of my players are on board. When I tried to run the game as it is written 8 years ago, it was not fun for anyone. The story has gigantic plot holes. One of the two main villains has a terrible motivation for destroying the world. He wants to have biological children with his gay lover and feels it is necessary to reboot the world to accomplish that goal. So his entire reason for being an antagonist is because he is one of the only two homosexual characters of the game. The writing of the game is difficult to use since the books were each lacking in important information and very railroady. The rule system had such terrible mechanics that it could only give the stats for 5 NPCs in the entire game and left the game masters no instruction to make enemies' character sheets. The rules also kept evolving in each book, which is confusing, and despite 2 soft reboots of the rules between book 2 and book 4, the game never actually balances itself enough for a newbie game master to use it properly. The characters and their motivations are so strange and so obtuse that the NPCs drive the plot into absurd directions all the time, and believe me, it is not fun for the players when you have to follow the orders of military superiors who are written to be incompetent at best and treacherous at worst. I could go on criticizing this game for days. In fact, I have an entire Discord server where all I do is talk shit about this game to my players. So, why did I decide to play this game? Well, there's a simple reason. A small fraction of the game's content is actually pretty good. Some of the rules for character creation are fantastic. All that the players really have to do is write their backstory, and the game master builds their stats based on how often any of the 6 stats appear in the backstory. Some parts of the world building also have an enormous narrative potential. For example, the setting has a real world and a parallel shadow world that is identical in every single way and observable through a powerful computer. The only difference in the shadow world is that the player characters, called glitches, were never born there. This setup places the players in a situation where they are seen as agents of free will because their actions could never be predicted by observing the shadow world. That's a fantastic idea for world building, and this game has enormous potential if you can get over its flaws. But I couldn't get over its flaws, so in order to play the awesome game that I knew was in those pages somewhere, I had to rip a few of them off. Part 1. The rules. Apart from the awesome character creation system, the rules are kind of bare bones. You have no skills and only 6 stats. The rules for psychic powers require a lot of math and often don't make sense. The game has a strong military missions vibe, but that doesn't fit with the rules that have so little to do with tactics. So that's a lot of things to change, and I didn't want to have to remake the entire game myself. So what did I do? Well, I looked for a game system that could replace the bits I didn't like. The game was about a group of soldiers with overpowered technological armors, a scale of 0 to 100 for stats, and military tactics style fights with some strange and dangerous psychic powers. It turns out that there is another game that has pretty much all of these aspects out there. It's not a very creative system, as I mentioned on this channel before, but I chose to adapt the game known as Deathwatch, and I pretty much took all of the mechanics and monster stats from that game. I had to rewrite just a little bit how the feats were worded for the Warhammer 40k universe, and I had to shave off some of the game mechanics like cohesion. I kept Sens's original character creation system along with the immersion system and the 6 stats: life, death, chaos, cosmos, creation and void, the 6 major forces of this setting. The combination worked great. It fixed all of the issues I had with the rules while staying true to the feel the game was going for. Later on in the episode's new mechanics, I introduced the coin tracker system that I took from a game that I also talked about on this channel, Sigmata: The Signal Kills Fascists. The coin tracker system allows the players to have a say in the kind of missions that they are sent on and to push the story in interesting directions if they refuse certain missions. It also works well to represent that there are often strong divisions inside of resistance movements and how to deal with them. The coin tracker system does this by dividing the resistance into 4 factions that each push the story and the outcome of the rebellion into a different direction. So, I did the same when we started the second book, which takes place on the moon. I created 4 factions of the resistance that fight the fascist empire together. Essentially, if you can take the game mechanics from another game to improve your campaign, then you should. Naturally, I was letting my players know about every change I brought to the system and letting them know how this would affect the story. They know the system that we are using is a constant work in progress because this combination of rules has never really been used before. But when we all acknowledge that every game system has its flaws, it's really easy to change them and fix them. The setting, on the other hand, was something that I had to work out on my own. Part 2. The setting. There were quite a few things that did not add up in the original setting of Sens. The story often unfolds like a mystery-based intrigue, but there is never any setup in the setting to hint for big reveals or even encourage players' interests in those mysteries. For example, Book 2 ends with the big reveal that one of the leaders of the resistance, Khrizar Orion, is in fact the immortal brother of the main antagonist, the Emperor. He was supposed to have died decades ago, but the brother is only really mentioned once before, and not in a way that the players would look into. Many characters have motivations and backstories that are only really there to move the plot along at the right time without much explanation. In fact, all of the leaders of the resistance have writing problems. Viggo Nemeo, the administrator of the South Pole base, turns out to be a traitor who joined the Empire, but he never revealed the positions of the resistance's hidden bases. Why? We may never know. Maria Gridway is only here to force a love triangle with 2 other immortals and have that lead to the kidnapping of one of the main characters in the second book. The Resistance's general is called Gladius Sword, for God's sake. His name means sword. So yeah, I made a list of everything that didn't make sense and I replaced it with something else. If you read some aspects of world building that makes no sense, like for example how economy changing the D&D 5e spell Goodberry is, well, you should feel free to change it. The more the setting makes sense to you, the better you can have it make sense to your players. So I just didn't use any of the characters I didn't like, and I replaced Gladius's name to Costa, the name of his father. I had kept those things in the first time that I ran the game, and all the inconsistencies in the setting and the characters were profoundly turning my players off, because they had a hard time believing in the game's world and its logic. There is also a lot of unused potential in the setting. For example, the game rarely ever touches upon the differences between the Shadow Worlds and the real world's histories, despite the fact that the characters can move freely from one to the other. So I made a point of exploring these differences that the player character's existence brought in a few of the scenarios. Part 3. The themes, philosophies, and politics. Sens is a weird game. It relies for some of its world building on knowledge of philosophers like Wittgenstein and his works on dialectics. In fact, the philosopher's works are treated as a game extension to the original books, and I really didn't see myself asking the players to read up on difficult philosophical texts as homework for a game. If you want to have a game about philosophy, you have to introduce the ideas of the philosophy into that story and let the player characters and the players get acquainted with them so that they can make choices about what they believe in. Likewise, the game claims to be about a rebellion that has anti-imperial sentiments, but the main NPCs are nobles within the imperial hierarchy. Like, every one of the 6 main immortals have nobility titles in the Empire, despite 5 of them actively trying to take down the Empire. So I mixed it up a little bit and changed the characters. I also introduced more queer characters in the main cast to avoid having the only 2 queer characters be the villains. I made it clear that the Immortal of Chaos is gender fluid and that the Immortal of Void is genderless. At this point, I have not introduced the aspect I'm about to mention in the story, but I also have the Immortals of Life and Death be transgender, which fits the story because one of them was pretending to be a different gender in the original game for half of the first book. Thanks to these changes, I made the characters more normal and relatable to my players, while also changing the theme of queerness into a positive one. Book 2 has some very interesting themes, so I kept them. In the second book, Sens, the players are tasked with turning public opinion on the moon in favor of the rebellion, while interacting with a society that reflects our own modern capitalist world. Those are themes I really like, especially since we need to encourage and glorify the destruction of capitalism if we want to survive as a species, especially in the modern day. So for me, sharing stories with those themes and the tactics and problems that can arise in those situations is a good way to engage and spread the political and strategic ideas that are becoming important in the real world. That's why I took the coin tracker mechanics from Sigmata for Book 2, because that game is all about overthrowing a dangerous regime while balancing the issues of a revolution. It's good to have mechanics that reflect the ideas of your story, because all mechanics encourage certain behaviors from your players. For example, one of the core themes of Sens is the meta-narrative, and a lot of thought was put into exploring in-game the relationship that players have with their characters. This is reinforced by the immersion system that I mentioned earlier. In the original game, instead of dice rolls, the variable to determine if you pass or fail an action is immersion points. The Game Master gives you immersion points for being involved with the game's setting and the story, and then you spend these points to ensure success on critical actions. This means your players are encouraged to think about the setting, have an emotional roleplay connection with it, and even push them to expand the setting themselves, because they get points for doing so. On top of that, the rule is that when you use an immersion point, it has a visual effect on the world that is a reference to the player's own life. This means that there is a direct connection between the player and the player character, even if it is a mysterious one where the characters slowly figure out that these miracles are caused by some entity that is watching over them. Hence, the theme of meta-narrative is reinforced by the game's mechanics, and that really helps the story long term. Sens, the original game, has a lot of flaws, but it is still playable with a few tweaks. See, when I criticize games in my reviews of the month videos, I never mean that you should never play those games. I sometimes urge players not to give money to the companies that produce problematic games, but my intent is to describe problems so that the game masters know about them and have the opportunity to fix them. If y'all are interested in what the game looked like after all of these modifications, I encourage you to have a watch here and see if you appreciate the changes we brought to the original content. I am also linking in the description below the resources like rules and setting changes that I compiled into some Google documents. Conclusion: you can improve your games too. This video is intended to show that you don't have to let bad games ruin your fun, especially if they have strong potential. If you need to change the setting, do so. If you need to change the themes or the rules to make the game more fun, you should give it a try. If you can, you should replace what you take out with something that you know that works. Take mechanics from other games, take NPC ideas from other settings and adapt them to your setting. Take themes that you like and put them in your stories. With a bit of critical thinking, you can come up with simple fixes for most problems you might encounter in a bad game. So go for it, because at the end of the day, the game is for you and your players, not the game publishers or writers who are behind it. This has been my review of the month. Thank you for watching the entire video. If you liked it, please consider sharing it with your fellow gamers, liking it, and subscribing for more content like this.